The clattering of iron wheels echoed across the vast prairies of the American Midwest. Inside the train cars, hundreds of weary Japanese soldiers pressed their faces against barred windows, staring out at a world they had never imagined. Rolling fields of corn stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with red barns and framed by skies so wide they seemed to swallow everything beneath them. Only weeks earlier, these men had crouched in foxholes or bunkers on Pacific islands, convinced that death was their only honorable fate. They had been told since boyhood that surrender was worse than dying, that capture would strip them of their honor, their families, their very humanity. Yet here they were, alive, disarmed, and carried deep into the heartland of their enemy. For the prisoners, the sight was disorienting. Back home in Japan, land was precious, carved into small, carefully tended plots. Here, the land seemed limitless. Even more bewildering was the silence that greeted them as the train slowed through towns. Civilians stood at crossings, staring not with hatred, but with curiosity. Children waved. Some even smiled, while their parents kept cautious eyes on the prisoners behind the glass. The Japanese men braced themselves for insults, for stones hurled against the train cars, for the venom of a people who had every reason to despise them. After all, Pearl Harbor still burned in American memory, a wound only 3 years old. Yet the hatred they anticipated never came. Instead, they saw nothing more threatening than the ordinary rhythm of American life. The silence unsettled them. Surely this was a trick, a mask hiding cruelty yet to come. Before capture, many had whispered the same rumors, that Americans starved their prisoners, that they tortured them, that vengeance for Pearl Harbor would be merciless. The train's passage into farmland seemed only to sharpen their dread. If hatred was not shouted at them, perhaps it waited in ambush, behind fences or inside camps. When the train finally squealed to a halt, the men's fears rose like a tide. Guards ordered them out with sharp voices, but not with blows. They marched into a compound rimmed with barbed wire, the air thick with expectation. Some prisoners flinched, bracing for the first strike. Yet no strike came. They were given rations: bread, potatoes, even meat. They were shown to clean bunks, with blankets folded neatly at the foot of each bed. This was not the starvation and humiliation they had been promised in whispered warnings. It was something far stranger: restraint. That strangeness cut deeper than cruelty might have. Why would the enemy care if they slept? Or if their bellies were full? Why would guards, who must have lost friends at Pearl Harbor or Guadalcanal, hold back their rage? For men trained to expect brutality, every act of ordinary decency felt like an unsettling puzzle. The first nights were restless. The barracks hummed with whispers as cicadas sang in the fields beyond the wire. Some prisoners were convinced the kindness was only temporary, a prelude to some hidden cruelty. Others argued that the Americans only wanted to use them for labor before discarding them. A few muttered that Americans were soft, too indulgent, too weak to inflict proper punishment. But none could dismiss the gnawing unease within them. Things were not unfolding as they had been told. And so, the story begins not on the battlefield, where rifles roared and men fell, but on the farms of America, where once sworn enemies would meet, not with bayonets, but with tools, fields, and words spoken with a gentleness that no soldier had been trained to expect. What unfolds in the chapters ahead is a tale of contradiction. Pearl Harbor's fire on one side, the quiet civility of American farmers on the other. It is the story of men discovering that even in war, humanity has a way of slipping through the cracks. Stronger than the hatred that armies work so hard to cultivate. This is not just a story about Japanese prisoners of war. It is about the shattering of illusions. The collision between propaganda and lived experience. And the simple truth that kindness, unexpected, unasked for, can prove more disarming than any weapon forged in battle. To understand the shock that Japanese prisoners of war felt upon stepping onto American soil, we must first return to the world that shaped them. A world forged in fire at Pearl Harbor and in the brutal code of the Imperial Japanese Army. On December 7, Japan had struck what it considered a decisive blow, crippling America's Pacific Fleet. To the Japanese people, it was heralded as a moment of triumph, proof of their nation's rising power. But to Americans, it was remembered as treachery. An attack that left over 2,000 sailors and soldiers dead in a single morning. The smoke of Pearl Harbor clung to the American imagination like a scar, ensuring that every Japanese soldier captured in the years that followed carried the shadow of that day on his shoulders. In Japan, military indoctrination ensured that no soldier expected survival in captivity. Since the days of the samurai, the idea of surrender carried a stain of shame. To lay down arms was not merely cowardice, it was betrayal of one's emperor, one's ancestors, one's family. Propaganda hammered home this point. Better to die with honor than to live in disgrace. The result was a force of men prepared to resist until death, convinced that capture would mean dishonor at best, torture at worst. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States approached the war with a very different philosophy regarding prisoners. The U.S. had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required humane treatment of captured soldiers, shelter, food, medical care, and protection from public humiliation. It was not only law but also strategy. By treating enemy captives well, America hoped to encourage reciprocity for its own soldiers held overseas, though. Tragically, this courtesy was rarely returned by Japan. This difference in mindset created the perfect storm for misunderstanding. The Japanese expected cruelty, because in their own camps, cruelty was the rule. American soldiers captured in the Philippines or on the march to Bataan had endured starvation, beatings, and death in staggering numbers. Japanese officers often believed that men who surrendered were already dishonored and thus unworthy of humane treatment. From their perspective, mercy was wasted on the weak. But in America, the situation was nearly reversed, as hundreds of thousands of young men shipped overseas to fight. The farms and factories of the Midwest faced a desperate labor shortage. By 1944, German and Italian prisoners of war had already been put to work across the country, harvesting crops, building roads, and helping keep the wartime economy alive. When Japanese prisoners began arriving, they too were seen not simply as enemies, but as a necessary workforce. This pragmatic need meant they were not left to rot in idleness or mistreatment. They were instead pulled into the very rhythm of American life. And so, by the time those trains rolled into the small towns of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Texas, two worlds collided. The prisoners carried in their minds the dark images painted by Japanese propaganda. America as a land of violence, where mobs would string them up on sight. Yet America carried its own images of the Japanese, ruthless fanatics who had bombed Pearl Harbor and committed atrocities in Asia. Both sides were primed for hatred. And yet, what unfolded in these prison camps did not follow the script written by either nation's propaganda. The Japanese prisoners were surprised to find food in abundance: meat, bread, vegetables, luxuries their own families back home could scarcely dream of under the strain of Allied blockades. They received medical attention when injured or ill. They were permitted to write letters home through the Red Cross. Something unthinkable in Japan's own camps. To appreciate just how extraordinary this was, one need only compare conditions across different battlefronts. In German-occupied Europe, Soviet prisoners died by the millions, starved and frozen in open fields. In the Pacific, Allied captives endured forced marches, labor in jungle camps, and execution without trial. By contrast, Japanese prisoners working in American cornfields might eat more in one meal than their families did in a week. The irony was almost unbearable. This contrast began to gnaw at the men. Some whispered that perhaps the Americans were only biding their time, fattening them up before unleashing some greater cruelty. Others, however, began to notice a pattern. American guards barked orders. Yes, but blows were rare. The structure was rigid, but not sadistic. Discipline was firm, but not humiliating. In subtle ways, America was revealing a strength the prisoners had never been taught to expect: the strength of restraint. And this restraint was not born merely of kindness. It was also strategic. The United States knew that every Japanese prisoner who returned home after the war would carry stories of how he had been treated. If those stories told of starvation and cruelty, America's reputation would suffer across the globe. But if those stories told of fairness, civility, even compassion, then America would project a different kind of power, moral power, as vital to the post-war world as military might. Thus, by the time Japanese POWs stepped off trains and into the barbed wire compounds of the Midwest, they stood at the intersection of two clashing philosophies of war. They had been trained to expect hatred, but instead met a nation guided, however, imperfectly by international law, by pragmatism, and by a belief that even enemies should be treated as men. It was a contradiction that would unsettle them at every turn. And when the announcement finally came that they would be sent out to work alongside ordinary American civilians, the very people whose loved ones had died at Pearl Harbor, the prisoners' fear reached its breaking point. They believed vengeance was coming. What they could not know was that this encounter, far from being an act of cruelty, would instead become the most powerful lesson of their captivity. The first days in the camps were not what the Japanese prisoners had been taught to expect. After the long journey across the Midwest, after the nervous glances from civilians at the crossings, they had braced for humiliation and cruelty. Yet what they encountered inside the barbed wire compounds was something far stranger: normality. Each dawn began with roll call. Guards, their rifles slung and their voices firm. Ice-cold names the prisoners barely understood. The men stumbled into formation, their uniforms ragged, their eyes wary. They anticipated the crack of a baton, the sting of a boot if they faltered. But when mistakes were made, when a man stepped out of line, or hesitated at a command, the Americans barked again. But they did not strike. The discipline was sharp, but it lacked the venom they knew so well from their own officers. This absence of violence was disorienting. The food was another shock. Prisoners had expected to be starved, to be thrown scraps as a daily reminder of their defeat. Instead, they were handed bread, potatoes, beans, sometimes even meat. Compared to the shortages and rationing in Japan, these meals were feasts. The first night, many ate cautiously, convinced the rations were some kind of deception, perhaps poisoned or laced with humiliation. Yet as the days passed, and the food kept coming, their suspicion gave way to unease of a different sort. Why would the enemy feed them so well? In the barracks, clean bunks awaited them, blankets folded neatly at the end of each bed. For soldiers who had been taught to expect death at the hands of their captors, The simple gesture of being allowed a warm night's sleep was profoundly unsettling. They lay awake, listening to cicadas buzzing in the distance, the low hum of tractors from neighboring farms. The sounds of rural America seeped into their nights, reminding them that outside the barbed wire, life continued without hatred, without the war's immediate fury. Conversations in those early nights were whispers, tense and urgent. Some insisted that this was all a ruse, that the Americans were merely disguising their cruelty until the moment came to reveal it. Others argued that the prisoners were being fattened, prepared for back-breaking labor that would break them down slowly. A few muttered darkly that Americans were too soft, that their kindness was weakness, proof of why they could never match the discipline of Japan's warriors. But beneath all these theories ran a single thread: confusion. Nothing was happening as it was supposed to. Then came the small gestures. Gestures that cracked the prisoner's expectations even further. A guard offering a cigarette to a man without one. A soldier helping a prisoner understand a shouted order with patient gestures instead of blows. Permission granted to write letters home through the Red Cross. Each act, trivial on its own, accumulated into a weight the prisoners could not ignore. These were not the actions of a merciless enemy. These were acts of men who, despite Pearl Harbor, despite the Pacific battles, still recognized the humanity of those who had once tried to kill them. Yet the true test came with the announcement that they would be put to work outside the camp. Not in factories or mines, as some feared, but on the farms that surrounded the compounds. For the Japanese, this was a prospect more terrifying than anything they had faced since capture. Soldiers were one thing. They expected discipline, coldness, perhaps even a grudging respect for fellow warriors. But civilians? Farmers who had lost sons or brothers to Japanese bullets? Wives who had watched telegrams arrive with news of deaths at Guadalcanal or Tarawa? Surely these people would unleash their hatred the moment the guards' backs were turned. The barracks buzzed with dread the night before the first work details. Men whispered of farmers spitting in their faces, children throwing stones, women cursing them as murderers. They imagined rough hands shoving them into fields, treating them like animals rather than men. No soldier in the Imperial Army had ever been prepared for kindness from civilians. Cruelty seemed inevitable. At dawn, they were marched out in formation. The crisp morning air carried the smell of tilled soil and cut grass. Foreign yet oddly calming, trucks waited beyond the gates, engines idling, their beds ready to carry prisoners deep into farmland. The men climbed aboard hesitantly, their eyes darting to the farmers who had gathered at a distance. To their astonishment, no jeers came. The farmers simply stood, watching quietly, some with arms crossed, others with children clinging to their sides. Their faces held caution, perhaps suspicion, but not the fiery hatred the Japanese had been led to expect. As the trucks rumbled along dirt roads, the prisoners' minds churned with dread. Each bump in the road felt like a step closer to humiliation. They pictured farmers striking them, guards turning away, vengeance delivered without mercy. Yet when the trucks stopped and they were ordered down, what they encountered was not rage, but ordinariness. A farmer wiping sweat from his brow as he stepped off a tractor. A woman hanging laundry on a line. Children chasing one another near a fence, pointing curiously at the strangers in worn uniforms. The prisoners were handed tools, hoes, sacks, shovels, and guided toward rows of crops. Gestures and a few halting words in English explained what needed to be done. The guards stood nearby, rifles resting casually, not raised in menace. The work was hard, but it was work the prisoners understood. Many had grown up in farming villages in Japan, though the crops were different: corn, wheat, sugar beets instead of rice. The rhythm of labor was familiar. What shocked them most was not the toil, but the way they were treated. The gods did not strike when they faltered. The farmers did not spit when they walked by. At midday, when the sun grew hot, they were ordered to rest. A farmer approached with a bucket of water, setting it down and dipping a ladle for them to drink. The prisoners froze, waiting for insult or trickery, but there was none. The water was cold, clean, and offered without malice. That night, the barracks hummed with stories of what had happened. Men spoke of children who had stared without fear, of women who continued their chores without hatred, of the farmer who had offered water as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Some laughed nervously. Others frowned in confusion. How could this be possible? How could a nation still mourning Pearl Harbor offer even a shred of civility to those who had caused it? The prisoners had expected the worst. Instead, they had encountered something far more dangerous to their beliefs: decency. And this was only the beginning. The second morning of labor began like the first, with prisoners filing nervously onto trucks, the guards silent and watchful. But this time, something was different. The men carried with them the memory of the water bucket, of the farmer's quiet gesture that had unsettled them more than any punishment could. They whispered about it as the trucks bounced along dusty roads, unsure whether to treat it as an anomaly or a sign of something deeper. When they arrived at the fields, the routine unfolded again. Tools distributed, rows assigned. The steady rhythm of work under the sun, yet the tension had shifted. The men still labored cautiously, waiting for the cruelty they believed inevitable. But each hour that passed without it chipped away at their fear. Then came the moment that would remain etched in their memories. A farmer's wife appeared from the porch of her house, carrying a basket in her arms. The prisoners stiffened. Here it comes. They thought the moment of humiliation. The words of scorn from a civilian who had every reason to hate them. The guards tensed as well, unsure what might happen. But the woman did not spit, did not curse. Instead, she reached into her basket and held out apples, their skins glistening red in the sunlight. She walked slowly down the row, handing them not to the guards but to the prisoners themselves. One by one, calloused hands, hands that had once carried rifles, now holding shovels, reached out hesitantly, almost fearfully. The men bowed their heads as they accepted the fruit, their voices murmuring in broken English, "Thank you." It was a small act, almost trivial. Yet for the prisoners, it was shattering. They had expected hatred, and instead they were given sweetness. They had braced for vengeance, and instead received a gift. The apple was no longer just a fruit. It was a symbol that pierced through every layer of propaganda they had carried with them. The farmer's wife had no reason to show kindness to men who wore the uniform of her enemy. And yet, she did. From that moment, the rhythm of the fields began to change. The prisoners still worked under guard, still carried the weight of defeat. But they no longer moved with the same fear. Farmers began to exchange nods with them, brief acknowledgments of shared labor under the same sun. Children watched from fences, sometimes daring to wave. A few prisoners, emboldened by gestures of civility, risked awkward smiles in return. The work itself grew strangely familiar. Many of the Japanese men had grown up in farming villages, accustomed to bending their backs in rice paddies. The tools were different, the crops foreign, but the feel of earth in their hands was the same. In these moments, they felt something they had not expected to feel in captivity, a faint echo of home. But with this familiarity came an ache they could not escape, as they filled sacks with sugar beets or hoisted bundles of wheat. They thought of their families across the ocean, families scraping by on rations, eating millet or barley instead of rice. Their bellies never full. Here, in the land of their enemy, food was so plentiful it could be shared with prisoners. The irony was bitter, and some men wept quietly at night, ashamed that their families starved while they themselves were fed by those they had been taught to despise. This emotional turmoil deepened as the weeks passed. Some prisoners clung fiercely to the old teachings, insisting that American kindness was weakness, a trick to soften them before some cruel betrayal. But others began to see a different pattern. The gods' restraint was consistent. The farmers' gestures of humanity, however small, accumulated into a quiet truth. The enemy was not what they had been told. One prisoner later recalled how a farmer once offered him a piece of bread during a midday break. It was nothing more than a torn hunk from the man's own lunch. Yet to the prisoner, it felt as though the entire world had tilted on its axis. Bread was a luxury at home, something his family might not see for weeks. And here it was, handed freely, without malice, by a man whose son might have fallen to a Japanese bullet. The effect of these encounters was profound. The prisoners did not suddenly forgive the war, nor did the farmers forget the sons and brothers lost in battle. The scars of Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal still ran deep. But in the fields of America, something unexpected happened. Humanity began to seep through the cracks of war. Perhaps the most powerful moment came not from the farmers, but from the prisoners themselves. One afternoon, as the workday ended and tools were being collected, a prisoner stopped, turned toward the farmer whose land he had labored on, and bowed deeply. It was the gesture of his culture, a sign of respect and gratitude. For a long moment, the farmer simply stared, unsure how to respond. Then, slowly, he lifted his cap in return. It was a brief exchange, no words spoken, no treaty signed, but it carried the weight of something greater than the war raging across oceans. In these fields, the men discovered that kindness could be more destabilizing than cruelty. Hatred they could have endured, punishment they had been prepared for, but civility, generosity, and the simple recognition of their humanity, those things left them unmoored. It was here, in the quiet labor of American farms, the Japanese prisoners began to understand a truth their leaders had hidden from them. The enemy was human too, and once that truth took root, it could not easily be forgotten. As weeks turned into months, the strangeness of captivity gave way to a new kind of routine. Each morning, the prisoners filed onto trucks, rode out to the fields, and bent their backs under the wide Midwestern sky. Each evening, they returned to their barracks, weary but intact, their bellies filled, their bodies unscarred by cruelty. What had once felt like a trick began to take on a deeper meaning. The small gestures of humanity, bread shared, water offered, apples given freely, were no longer isolated surprises. They became patterns, repeated so consistently that even the most suspicious among them could not ignore the truth. The Americans, whether guards or farmers, were not driven by vengeance. They treated the prisoners with firmness, yes, but also with fairness. And in that fairness lay a quiet power the Japanese had not expected. This realization unsettled many of the men. For years, they had been taught that Americans were monsters, decadent, soft, and cruel. Japanese propaganda had shown caricatures of the enemy grotesque, inhuman, undeserving of respect. Yet here they were, eating better than their families back home, receiving medical care when sick, and being spoken to not as beasts but as men. The contradiction gnawed at them. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers had watched Allied prisoners collapse from starvation, had seen them beaten, denied even the smallest dignity. If cruelty was the standard by which enemies were measured, Then why did America refuse to follow that path? Some men felt shame, recalling what their own army had done in places like the Philippines or Nanking. Others clung to the belief that American kindness was nothing more than weakness, an inability to show true warrior strength. But in the quiet of the barracks, as they lay awake, listening to the hum of crickets beyond the wire, many admitted to themselves what they dared not say aloud: they had been deceived. This dawning realization carried painful consequences. The prisoners began to reflect not only on their captors, but on their homeland. Letters from Japan spoke of hunger, of shortages, of bombings that reduced cities to rubble. Families were eating millet, barley, even grass to survive. Some prisoners received news that relatives had died from malnutrition or air raids. And yet, in the land of the enemy, food seemed endless. The irony was bitter. The supposed monsters fed them more generously than their own leaders had fed their people. For some, this awareness sparked anger, not at the Americans, but at the Japanese military elite who had lied to them, who had sent them into battles they could not win, and who had insisted that surrender was worse than death. For others, it sparked grief, a heavy sorrow that their families suffered while they, prisoners of war, lived in relative safety. In the silence of the barracks, more than one man wept, ashamed that he could not share his rations with his starving children back home. The longer the captivity lasted, the more the human connections deepened. Farmers who at first kept their distance grew accustomed to the presence of the Japanese workers. Some exchanged simple words, pointing out how to harvest or offering a curt good work. A few even went further, nodding in quiet respect, handing over a piece of fruit, or allowing prisoners to rest in the shade of a barn during the hottest afternoons. None of these gestures erased the memory of Pearl Harbor or Guadalcanal, but they softened the edges of hatred. What emerged was not friendship, but recognition. Both sides saw in the other something they had not expected: ordinariness. The farmers realized that these men were not faceless enemies, but young soldiers far from home, missing their families just as much as they did. The prisoners realized that Americans were not monsters, but people who plowed fields, raised children, and mourned their dead. The psychological effect was profound. Many prisoners later wrote in diaries or memoirs that their time in American camps reshaped their view of the world. One described how he could not reconcile the propaganda of his youth with the kindness he had seen firsthand. Another recalled that the moment a farmer's wife handed him bread, he realized for the first time that he had been misled about the enemy. When compared to other war fronts, the significance becomes even clearer. In the Soviet Union, German prisoners froze in the snow, millions dying in open fields without shelter. In Japanese camps across Asia, Allied soldiers endured forced marches, slave labor, and execution. Against this backdrop, the treatment of Japanese prisoners in America was extraordinary. It was not perfect. There were incidents of harshness, moments of prejudice, but in the broader landscape of World War II, it stood as a remarkable exception, and this exception carried consequences far beyond the war itself. When the prisoners were finally released and sent back to Japan, they carried their stories with them. They spoke of the farmers who shared food, of the guards who refrained from cruelty, of the children who waved instead of jeering. In a nation devastated by bombings and defeat, these stories offered a different perspective on the enemy. They showed that America's power was not only in its weapons or its factories, but also in its capacity for humanity. Historians have argued that this humane treatment helped lay the foundation for the post-war relationship between the United States and Japan. It did not erase the bitterness of war, but it planted seeds of respect. seeds that would later grow into one of the closest alliances of the modern world. The prisoners, once convinced that Americans were demons, returned home with testimonies that contradicted the old propaganda, and in doing so, they became quiet ambassadors of a truth far stronger than hate, that kindness, even in the shadow of war, can disarm more powerfully than any weapon. This was the great irony of their captivity. The Americans could have broken them with cruelty. Instead, they unsettled them with decency. And in the end, it was that decency, not bombs, not bullets, that left the deepest mark. The day of departure came quietly. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. And now the prisoners were to be sent home. For months they had lived behind the barbed wire of American camps, marched to the fields each morning, and returned each evening with sore backs and calloused hands. The farms of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Texas had become unlikely classrooms, teaching lessons no officer or textbook could have conveyed. Now, as trucks lined up to carry them away, the prisoners prepared to leave behind not only the soil they had labored in, but also the unexpected humanity they had discovered there. They gathered their few belongings: letters, small carvings made from scrap wood, perhaps a photograph taken by a guard, and slung them over their shoulders. Guards called roll, their voices steady, professional, without malice. The prisoners filed into formation, just as they had done countless mornings before. But this morning was different. There was no field work waiting, no baskets of apples, no bread broken in shared silence. There was only the journey home, across the ocean to a nation they no longer recognized, devastated by firebombs and atomic blasts. As the trucks rumbled toward the train station, something remarkable happened. Farmers began to appear along the roadside. Some leaned against fence posts, arms crossed, hats pulled low to shield their eyes from the morning sun. Others stood with wives and children, watching in silence. There were no jeers, no stones, no words of vengeance. Instead, there were nods, feigned smiles, and quiet gestures of respect. One prisoner, overcome with emotion, stood abruptly in the back of the truck and bowed deeply toward a farmer who had shared water with him on a blistering summer day. To his astonishment, the farmer lifted his cap in return. Another farmer, older and grizzled, simply raised a hand in farewell. Children waved as the trucks passed, their small voices calling out unintelligible but cheerful words. For men who had braced for hatred, this farewell felt almost unbearable in its gentleness. At the station, the prisoners were loaded onto trains, their destinations uncertain. Some would return to villages flattened by bombings, where their families waited with empty stomachs and weary hearts. Others would find no families at all, only ruins where their homes had once stood. They did not know what awaited them in Japan, but they carried something unexpected, memories of kindness from the very people they had been taught to hate. One man later wrote in his diary that the hardest moment of his captivity was not its beginning, but its end. "I thought I would rejoice to be free," he confessed. "Instead, I wept, because I knew I was leaving behind something precious, proof that even enemies can be human." Printation. Frooms. One no. The farewells were brief, without ceremony, yet they lingered in the prisoners' minds long after the barbed wire was behind them. They remembered the farmer's wife who handed out apples, the guard who offered cigarettes, the farmer who bowed in return to a prisoner's gesture of respect. These were not grand events, not moments that would ever appear in history books or war memorials, but for the men who experienced them, they were unforgettable. Back in Japan, Their stories spread. Neighbors and family members, hardened by hunger and grief, listened in disbelief as returning prisoners described their treatment in America. Some refused to believe it. How could the enemy, the same enemy who had dropped bombs on Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, have shown kindness to captured soldiers? Yet the testimonies kept coming, consistent and unshaken. Slowly, these stories began to erode the caricatures that wartime propaganda had carved into the minds of both nations. The legacy of those encounters stretched far beyond individual memories. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt and forged a new relationship with the United States, the testimonies of former POWs played a quiet but important role. They were proof that reconciliation was possible, that hatred need not be eternal, that even in the darkest chapters of history, there had been sparks of humanity. And so, the story of the Japanese prisoners in America is not merely a footnote of World War II. It is a reminder that the true measure of victory is not only in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the ability to hold on to humanity when the world demands cruelty. When the trucks carried those men away for the last time, the image of farmers lifting their hats, of children waving, of quiet nods exchanged between enemies, became a closing chapter far more powerful than any weapon. For in that moment, the prisoners understood a truth that no officer, no emperor, no propaganda could erase. In the shadow of war's darkest moments, kindness can endure, and sometimes it can change the course of history.